Okay, welcome everybody to this timely event on governance and accountability for a seamless transit network. My name is Adina Levin. I'm Advocacy Director with Seamless Bay Area. And how public transportation is governed, who makes the decisions, how they get their jobs, what decisions do they make? This wasn't covered on Schoolhouse Rock, and you probably didn't learn about it in school. But it's an important part of government that deeply affects how many of us lead our daily lives, not to mention our ability to collectively combat climate change. And there are questions all around the nation about how public transit serves the public. And there also are distinctive governance challenges here in the Bay Area, which is famous for fragmentation with 27 different agencies operating traditionally largely in separate silos, responsible for moving people on one brand of bus or train rather than a passenger from the start to the end of their journey. Since the pandemic, transit agencies in the Bay Area have been coordinating in an unprecedented fashion and making the system easier to use and more accessible for riders is seen as an existential need to grow back transit ridership, which dropped precipitously during the pandemic. But the fragmented status quo is sticky. There are decision processes that are right now in the works with the potential to govern Bay Area transit in a way that could be more coordinated, accessible, and accountable to riders. And so it's important for people, transit riders, those of us that depend on the system, to pay attention and speak up. And it's also election season, and your votes will be important to shape transit governance. So we're pleased to have a panel of experts and leaders to talk about transit governance and how it can be accountable to riders for running a more rider-friendly and accessible system. We're going to hear from Stephanie Lotshaw, who's Program Director of TransitCenter, which recently conducted a study on this subject. Frank Welty, with the California Council of the Blind, who serves with me on the also serves with me on the MTC Policy Advisory Council. Director Janice Lee, who's an elected member of the BART board, and Ian Griffiths with Seamless Bay Area, a nonprofit with a mission to bring about a seamlessly integrated public transportation system, including governance reforms to bring that about. Looking forward to the Q&A at the end, and please do put your questions in the chat to the moderators, and we will take the questions at the end. So looking forward to the presentation and discussion, and we'll start off with Stephanie Lotshaw.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone can see my screen. So as Adina mentioned, my name is Stephanie Lotshaw. I'm a program director at TransitCenter, and we're based in New York. So the governance has been a focus for us over the years in various ways. And we've really been attuned to who makes decisions about transit and who uses it, because our anecdotal observation was more often than not, those are two very different groups of people. The US is largely car-centric, and yet public transit agencies make decisions that affect the health, economic status, and social well-being of many. Decisions like where to site a bus stop, how to schedule a service change, how much to charge for service, how to allocate capital improvements, affect people's access to jobs, education, medical care, and other necessities beyond just public transit. Our most recent report on this topic, Who Rules Transit, you can see here. Our intention with this was to evaluate if there actually is a disconnect between who decides and who rides, and how that can and should change. Board appointments are positions of power, and with responsibility. They oversee the allocation of millions, if not billions of dollars of public funds. And the people that sit on those boards should be held by people that are attuned to the needs of the public in the delivery of those services, and ideally are those that reflect the diversity of riders and the communities that are most affected by those decisions. And while race and gender and ethnicity are not the only determinants of someone's personal experiences and levels of access and opportunity, we think it's very critical to evaluate who is most affected by decisions and how their voices and experiences are heard and accounted for. So we started our analysis with, we started our analysis by looking at gender representation versus population and ridership at about 12 different transit agencies across the United States. Our analysis revealed that there is, in fact, a pattern of disparities between who sits on agency boards and who uses transit in those three ways: geography, gender, and race. Geographically, suburban jurisdictions, which are often whiter and higher income, but with lower ridership per capita than urban jurisdictions, tend to be overrepresented on transit agency boards relative to population and ridership, as you can see in this chart. Geographic disparity is often rooted in statutes or in intergov agreements, which grant more board seats per capita to suburban jurisdictions than to the principal city where most of the transit riders live. In Philadelphia, for example, at SEPTA, and in New York City at the MTA, they both have a disproportionately high representation of suburban jurisdictions in relation to their share of the overall population that rides transit. You can see here that about 38% of the service area residents and 71% of the transit riders live in Philadelphia, but only 13% of the board seats are allocated to the city's representatives. In New York City, we see a similar mismatch of about 18% of board seats going to actual New York City representatives. In circumstances like this, we see resources being argued over based on jurisdiction versus based on the amount of riders who might benefit from investments. And that can obviously lead to outcomes that are not beneficial for the public. So next we have an analysis by race. So the geographic bias, as I mentioned, often carries a racial dimension, and that of course has implications for decision making. We can see here that the populations of Richmond, New Orleans, Savannah, New York, and Philadelphia, particularly the populations that ride transit, have a much higher proportion of Black residents and residents with lower incomes than the adjoining jurisdictions that are granted board seats. So this lack of racial diversity means that those voices and experiences aren't heard and debated in those agencies' deliberations and decisions, and that ultimately investments, whether it's in capital, whether it's in service, are not benefiting communities that are really the core transit ridership. So the next we have our analysis by gender. So we also saw a lot of significant disparities in gender representation. Men in general and white men in particular are overrepresented on transit agency boards, actually except for in San Francisco at the San Francisco MTA. But in general, they're overrepresented in relation to the overall population, and even more so in relation to transit riders. Out of our sample size of 108 board members, only 30% are women, in comparison to like around 51% in comparison to 51% of transit riders being women. So you can see here, 13% of SEPTA's board, 14% of WMATA's board, and 20% of DART's board are women, and they make up a significant percentage of ridership. As with race and geography, we see that the gap in gender representation on boards has service planning and policy consequences. Women have different travel patterns than men. Women more often take length trips. Men's travel patterns are typically more commuter, 9 to 5, in and out of work and back. And the lack of representation on boards means that we don't see in our service what the kinds of service hours, the kinds of travel patterns that we actually need to address those riders. There are other aspects of policy that suffer from this lack of representation. Public safety is one. Women experience greater violence and harassment on transit, and without female or femme voices on boards, we don't see that in our discussions of public safety. And in a broader context, we see a few examples across the United States about how board representation can influence outcomes. We profiled these in the report, and I'll go over a few of them. In New Orleans, the appointers, who are the mayor of New Orleans, appoints the entire RTA board. The past Mitch Landrieu and current Mayor LaToya Cantrell Both prioritize people who had experience riding transit. The longtime chair who recently resigned, Flozell Daniels, rode transit as a child in New Orleans, and he continues to, and he brought that experience onto the board. Similarly, the RTA board member, Fred Neal, is a longtime transit advocate in the region, and he actually started their local transit advocacy group, Ride New Orleans. So those experiences and those perspectives are really important in shaping what the board did. And in fact, several years ago, they used to be a purely contracted service, and the board members, composed of several of those individuals and more, actually made the shift to it being to it not being a contracted service, to them taking the administration of the service in-house and leading to significant kind of changes in ownership locally that was really beneficial for what they're doing in the city. Similarly, in Chicago, appointers prioritize individuals with disabilities on the board, and that has made CTA one of the leading agencies in terms of elevator accessibility in the United States. And so, this just shows how putting people on a board that have lived experience and are connection to affected communities results in better outcomes for transit. Oops, sorry. So there are two final things that the report really focuses on. We talk a lot about how crucial transparency and appointment processes are. In most of the cities and transit agencies that we reviewed, the appointment processes are really obscure. In fact, the BART election, there aren't that many elected boards in the United States. Most of them are just appointed. And those appointment processes are very convoluted, they're very obscure, and they make it really difficult for citizens and advocates to understand who is responsible and accountable for the agency. I am based in New York, and it is a long time, a very well recognized issue amongst the transit advocates here that nobody understands that the governor of New York is actually the one responsible for the MTA. It's not the mayor. As I mentioned before, the mayor doesn't have actually that many appointments on the board, and that means that the general public is really isn't as aware of like who is actually making decisions for the agency ultimately, and it makes it difficult. Like, people aren't advocating to the right person that has the responsibility for making change. There's a similar problem in the state of Oregon, where the TriMet, which is the local agency in Portland, all the board appointments come from the governor also, and people are just not talking to the people that are actually holding power in those circumstances. In San Francisco, in the region, and I'm not familiar with all of the 26 different agencies, but I know they have a variety of appointment processes. With SFMTA, the mayor appoints the board. With BART, it's elected, obviously, and I know that VTA, actually we profiled VTA as unfortunately not a stellar example of appointments because it comes from a multitude of appointers in the region, which I have heard makes the board kind of decision-making process very difficult, because there isn't one united vision for like what the agency is supposed to do, because there's a lot of competing interests. But in either case, whether you have appointed or elected boards, it's critical that who appoints the board members or how they get into those positions is clear, because then we can hold them accountable and responsible in a better way, and we see better outcomes. And then finally, opportunities for change. This is something that we think is really important for advocates to recognize. And actually, I was at a conference where I was talking to the Black Voters Matter lead for the state of Georgia, and she was like, oh my God, small boards, local boards are so important for people to focus on, because as I mentioned before, they're stewards, they have a fiduciary responsibility for potentially billions of dollars in public funding. And they need to be watchdog and monitored and held accountable for decision making. It's not just the CEO and the staff of the agency, and they are they're the end. They're the decision-making body. And so for advocates to see these positions as a key audience to influence and critical to pay attention to as appointment decisions are made is super important as we think about the kinds of service outcomes that we want, as we think about the kind of capital outcomes we want, and as we think about how we want our regions to grow and thrive. So with that, I will turn it back over to Adina and wait for questions later.
All right. Thank you so much. That perspective is really very helpful in terms of thinking about what the choices are and thinking about what riders and advocates can do. And next, I'm going to turn this over to Frank.
Hi, this is Rich Hedges. How are you doing?
Hi, Rich.
Dave, can you help with the muting? Uh, uh, Frank Welty is with the California Council of the Blind and also serves with me on the Policy Advisory Council to the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and would looking forward to hearing from Frank and the and your perspective.
Adina, thanks for including me on this panel today. I'm delighted to be here. And Stephanie, that was a marvelous introduction to the issue of governance and the need for representation on boards. I totally concur with that. And I would add that as well as women and people of color, that we also need representation of people with disabilities. As Adina mentioned, I am a member of the MTC Policy Advisory Council, and I have been on that body for about a year and a half. Let me pause for a moment while it's addressed.
So I'm sure it's probably something like secondhand smoke related.
And I also happen to be blind, and I'm very much enjoying my opportunity to be on the council, where I can learn a great deal and hopefully give some useful input in the development of policy for transit in the Bay Area. I had a very interesting experience not long after I came on the council. We were just in the process of the MTC was in the process of rolling out the very exciting latest Bay Area Plan 2050, which is our long-range plan for transit and related fields in the Bay Area. And it was very exciting, a lot of really wonderful material in there. I thought that the plan was very forward-looking. It addressed a lot of important issues like land use, like the environment, housing concerns, issues of social and economic justice. But I didn't find that it did a good job of addressing the issues of people with disabilities. If you do a word search on the document, you can't find things like wheelchair or accessible or accessibility. You find a few references to the word disability, but it's mainly in passing and sort of throwaway lines like, this policy is great for people with economic concerns, seniors, and people with disabilities, and that's about as far as it goes. In the related action plan, there's a little bit more. There's some language there about paratransit, but not a lot. And so it made me realize that there's a problem, that that the current processes that are in place don't seem to do a good job of really capturing the concerns of the disability community in the Bay Area. And I'm not putting anybody down for that. I think the people involved are great people that are doing the best they can. But I think that there are ways we can improve on that. And I want to mention three in particular. The first one is inclusion. The second one is information. And the third one is incorporation. And what I mean by inclusion is that people with disabilities must be at the table, because if we're not at the table, we're going to be on the menu. And that means that people with disabilities need to be more represented on governing boards and commissions and the like. We also need to be more representative in the agencies that are doing the planning. There needs to be much more hiring of people with disabilities so that we can be involved in the discussions when plans are being made. The second issue is information. For better or worse, our society doesn't do a good job of planning, of educating most of us in an authentic way about disabilities. That includes academia at all levels. Hey, if you have a PhD, you may be an expert in your field, but you don't know much about disability because you weren't trained. That's also true of the media, popular culture. It just doesn't happen for the most part. And that lack of understanding translates into mistakes that get made in decision making in all areas of policy. But I think that's certainly true for transportation. And so it's very important that the voices of people with lived experience in disability need to be representative, and people who work in transit need to be better informed about disability issues. And also agencies need to do a better job of making information available to people in disability in formats that they can access. I found that to be a challenge in my role as a policy advisory council member, being able to actually decipher the documents that I receive because I read them on a computer screen reader. But also, I think that there needs to be a lot more disability awareness training in the organizations that deal with transit, both in terms of at the management level, but also at the frontline staff of people like operators and customer service personnel and the like, in order to do a better job of addressing those concerns. And the third area for opportunity is what I call incorporation, which is that disability concerns need to be addressed at every step of the transportation planning and operations. And that means actually building disability concerns into the systems that result in policies or procedures. In my opinion, that means that every form, every questionnaire, every data analysis worksheet, every meeting needs to be addressing the question, how does this thing we're deciding right now address people with disabilities? And the sooner that those questions get raised, the better they're going to be solved and at lower cost. What often I find is that by the time a policy is ready to be presented to an advisory body like the one I'm on, a lot of decisions have been made in the background that limit our options for improving outcomes in terms of disability. In a sense, the concrete has already been poured, both figuratively and literally. And so the way to make sure that things get figured out before the concrete gets poured is to be asking the right questions and gathering the right data at every step of the process. And I think that's an opportunity that we have if we're willing to open up those processes and procedures to scrutiny to make things better in the future. And those are the three things I want to leave with you about that. Remember, inclusion, information, and incorporation. And so, Adina, I return the floor.
Thank you so much for that really important perspective. Want to turn over the mic to BART Board Director Janice Lee, who will share a little bit about what is it that a transit board member does actually, and then feel free to address some of the questions about accountability and representation that have been raised to date. Don't feel the need to address them all. We can get to more in the Q&A. Speaking of Q&A, if you have pent up questions, please put them in the chat for us to get to at the end. Janice.
Yes, so thank you so much, Adina. Hi, everyone. I'm Janice Lee. I am really excited to be here with you all. I see a lot of familiar names of the participants and just want to give a really hearty thank you to Seamless Bay Area, particularly Adina and Ian, for pulling together such great folks on this panel. I think a lot of you may know me already, but as just a little intro here, I am a BART Board Director representing District 8, which is sort of the west side of San Francisco. How I got into transportation in the first place is I worked at the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition for over 8 years, advocacy director for most of that. Actually now I work at Chinese for Affirmative Action, where I work on addressing anti-API hate locally. So I first won my seat in 2018, had never run before, had never really considered running, and just sort of fell into the seat during an open race. And I'm very proud to be running unopposed for re-election now. I'm currently the vice president of the board, and I am the hopeful board president next year. So the first question really here is, what does a transit board member do? So just a quick rundown of BART governance first. When you look at the map, or when someone once again says, what if only we had that plan where BART actually went on the Golden Gate Bridge to Marin? When people ask those questions, it's always, why is BART the way it is? And the reason for that is there was a BART Act passed by the state legislature in 1957, which really set up the infrastructure of BART and its governance. That meant that the BART district is comprised of 3 counties: San Francisco, which is a city and county, and then the 2 East Bay counties, Alameda and Contra Costa. While BART does go now to 5 counties, down to Berryessa and Santa Clara, and then certainly throughout San Mateo County on the San Francisco side of the bay, only 3 counties actually make up the district, and those 3 counties are split up into 9 unique districts with directly voter elected directors. Those 9 unique districts are about 400,000 constituents each. They don't really match up with anything. In San Francisco, they look a little bit like the state assembly districts, but it just looks like nothing. It's very unique, and no one knows that it is the way it is. And as Stephanie mentioned, it's very rare to have directly voter elected transit boards. There's only 3 in the country. 2 of them here in the Bay Area, AC Transit and BART Board, and then you've got Denver, their regional transit there has a directly voter elected board. So what we do is actually quite simple. When you sort of get to the nuts and bolts, we oversee the general manager. We hire and fire and do performance reviews of the general manager who manages day-to-day operations. There's a few other board appointed officers, but the general manager is the main one. We set policies, so we can pass resolutions, we can pass policies around affordable housing to fair policy and beyond. We approve contracts, so anything over $100,000 needs to get approval by the BART board. Usually our contracts are enormous. I remember one of my first contracts I approved on the BART board was a $96.5 million contract to replace all of the escalators in downtown San Francisco stations. We set the budget, so we pass the budget annually. And that's it. So hire, fire the GM, set policies, approve contracts, and approve the budget. With all that said, I would say the BART board is probably one of the most hands-on transit boards I've seen. I think there's a culture there. I think we're directly voter elected. I think there's a lot of different sort of historic reasons here. So moving into this question of accountability, representation, and why are transit boards the way they are, I'll just sort of back up and say, one of the main reasons I decided to even consider running for the BART board and why I really stuck around the Bike Coalition for so long is I really love transportation as a policy issue and as an advocacy area. I sort of fell into my job at the Bike Coalition and never expected to spend this career and all these years doing transportation work. But as I was doing more and more campaign work as a community organizer with the Bike Coalition, I started realizing what a real issue transportation was. It's one of the most on the ground, impactful policy areas that just inevitably affects everyone. Everyone has a transportation conundrum every single day. You're figuring out how to get to work, but also running an errand. You're trying to figure out, where you can have your kids, go play after school. You're trying to figure out how you go see a friend and how you're going to get there. All of these things are very, very real issues that you face on an every single day basis. And there's something really fascinating about how even the most convoluted, weird, sort of arcane transportation policy has a very direct impact to people's everyday experiences. So I'll just sort of point out 2 issues that I see with accountability and representation, which lead to a lot of the issues that Stephanie showed around transit board representation. I think those graphs and everything that Stephanie talked through, you're starting to see some issues here and you understand some of the systemic issues that cause us to be where we are. So one of the first things is, as much as I just talked about how amazing transportation is as a policy area because of the realness of what we do, unfortunately, a lot of the transit and transportation conversations very quickly become abstract and theoretical. So, for example, we talk about headways and increasing headways with theoretical impacts on communities of color, like, oh, well, the Chinese community is going to be able to take, that bus from Chinatown to the Bayview, because there's these two different Chinese communities living there. If we just increase the headways on this bus line, it makes sense, but that's a theoretical impact. Or we talk about fare policy as conceptually benefiting low-income individuals. Transfer discounts, it's going to help, low-income folks. Or even around, people with disabilities, we talk about new fare gates, just theoretically as being more accessible. I think that a lot of times those conversations are not directly connected to the actual human beings who are being impacted. And so in my role as a BART board director, I've always tried to talk to people directly when we are looking at fare gates. I went out to the stations with BART's accessibility task force that had folks with all different kinds of disabilities there, really testing out some of the new fare gate options. But as much as we really can make our work in transit as real and on the ground as possible, I think that really helps with both the representation and accountability question. And we have to find ways to bring people into that conversation as much as possible. And then the second issue I really see is we really, really struggle to have strong transit leaders, especially on transit boards and commissions. Even for directly voter elected boards like BART and AC Transit, you still struggle with that representation. And just like a laundry list of things. First, mounting a campaign is super, super hard. And it's really hard to describe just how overwhelming it is until you've been in it and done it and been flooded with candidate questionnaires. And then suddenly you have to raise all this money, and raising money for such a down ballot race is so hard. But then your districts are enormous. My district is 400,000 people. It's like half of San Francisco. I talked to Alfred Tu, who I think many of you know, running for AC Transit Board, because it's an at-large seat. It's 1.5 million people that that they'd be representing, and it just makes it so incredibly difficult to raise money and then also win. And then if you do win, they certainly don't pay well. BART is one of the most well-paid elected seats, but I get about $1,400 after taxes each month, which is quite good, but that doesn't even cover my rent that I pay every month. And then after winning, you've got to deliver. And especially for folks like many of you in this Zoom room here, folks who are advocates who are running on an activist platform, if you've run such an incredible campaign that you win, you then have to show that you can work within the systems. And then occasionally, well, what happens is you get into this board and this agency, and you suddenly want to make all this change, and then you quickly realize that a lot of times these agencies are occasionally dinosaur institutions. They have their dinosaur ways, and that making meaningful and actual change while also holding yourself accountable to the base that got you elected is really, really hard. And there's no roadmap for that. There are tons of organizations and networks that will help you get elected, but basically none of them help you be a really good board member. So I'll just sort of leave you with this. As you think about how we can build transit board leaders, transit champions in the Bay Area who will get things on the ballot, who will get the funding that we need to keep our region moving. Really, how can we get more people who care about transit running for office in a real, sustainable, meaningful way? And how do we keep pushing that question of building transit leadership in the region despite all these challenges? So I'll pass it back to you, Adina.
All right. Thank you very much, Janice. I've got questions which we will get to at the end, and wanted to turn it over to Ian Griffiths with Seamless Bay Area, who will talk about some of the processes in place where the Bay Area is considering making changes to its transit governance, particularly grappling with some of the issues of a fragmented system. Ian, let us know what's going on.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm policy director for Seamless Bay Area. And, our organization, as many of you know, advocates for a world-class integrated rider-focused transit system with an equitable, affordable fare system, an excellent rider experience. But that really relies off of having accountable, efficient, effective public transit institutions. And that's why we focus so much as an organization on this question of governance. This is a diagram of not only the 27 transit agencies in the Bay Area, but also some of the regional institutions involved in decision making. And I don't need to go through this diagram in detail. I think it sort of speaks for itself in terms of it's extremely complex. So many riders do use multiple agencies, rely off of the network as a whole to get where they need to go, yet there really isn't an overarching body other than the state of California, which is very, very far away, that is accountable for the system as a whole. And in terms of how the different boards are appointed, the dominant method for boards in the Bay Area is that, like VTA, like the example Stephanie mentioned, it's for the most part, it's city council members and county supervisors that are not directly elected, but appointed from different cities and counties that make up a particular transit district, forming the majority of members that are on local agencies, as well as for MTC, the main regional institution that we have. And all of these institutions are sort of operating at a very similar level of government. There isn't a clear hierarchy in terms of who's responsible for the regional scale and what the relationship is between institutions like in MTC and transit agencies such as BART. Seamless has long advocated for a regional network manager, and this is based on research of other regions that have much higher ridership transit systems and that do offer a seamlessly integrated experience. So a transportation network manager is an institution that houses certain functions of the transit system at a regional scale. And while there's a number of different structures that those can take, the common features is that the functions that they oversee at the regional scale are somewhat common, including not only long-range planning, fare policy, setting service standards, but also the customer experience, oftentimes branding, and even in many cases, project delivery. So it's possible to have a network manager and to have multiple operators in a region, but the division of responsibilities needs to be clearly defined. For riders, really, this means there's one place for riders to go. If there's an issue that needs to be addressed that involves multiple agencies, that there's one accountable institution that is responsible for delivering an integrated system, which is something we lack right now in the Bay Area. The Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force was something that was assembled in the wake of the pandemic to address not only the near-term crisis in public transit, but also set us on a trajectory for how do we not just rebuild the system that we had prior to COVID, but how do we actually create a much more effective system? And in that transformation action plan set of recommendations that was adopted by that body about a year ago, this issue of the lack of network management resources and authority, this governance issue, it was highlighted as one of the key problems that we need to address. So there were two actions in that study to address that. One is completing this action 13, completing a business case analysis of potential network management reform. So basically that means doing a governance study of how should we reform governance to be able to meet our regional objectives and increase transit use overall and accessibility. That was aimed to be completed by the middle of 2022 when it was adopted about a year ago. And then a related study that was identified in that action plan was something called the Regional Rail Study that looks specifically at, are there reforms to the regional rail system, the sort of 5 or 6 agencies that run rail in the Bay Area that would lead to better outcomes for our region. So thinking about boards specifically and who sits on boards and appointment processes, it's something Seamless has given a lot of thought to, and we did some research and published a report last year thinking about who should sit on the board or what should be the board of a network manager in the Bay Area. What form should that take? And they, you know, it involves a lot of the questions that have already been brought up in this discussion already. So looking at examples from around the country and the world, we see that there's a wide range of how boards are set up, from directly elected governing boards such as BART and AC Transit, as we've talked about. The next column here is the dominant form in the Bay Area, which is that it's appointed boards, but made up of almost entirely locally elected officials that, sitting on a transit agency board is their secondary responsibility. Their primary responsibility is being a city council member or county supervisor. There's many other examples of appointed boards that are made up of a majority of professionals, and in many cases riders with lived experience, from Atlanta to London. SFMTA is one that's fully, made up of non-elected officials, as well as TriMet in Portland, Metrolinx in Toronto. And then there's some, TransLink in Vancouver is an example of a sort of two-tiered board with an upper level of elected officials, but that have a limited set of responsibilities like approving the budget. And a lot of the policy decisions are done by a lower tier professional and rider board. So this study that we're now in the midst of in the Bay Area, the network management business case, kicked off in January, seeking to identify, what is the recommended governance structure to lead to those outcomes of seamless fares and payment, improved customer information, a more connected network, and greater accessibility. It's overseen now by an advisory group of 7 transit agency general managers and 7 other stakeholders. And it got off to a very promising start. However, after 6 months, it was recently refocused to, largely driven by the transit agency general managers that sit on that task force, to be delayed and to focus, again, not on whether we should regionalize certain key functions, but on analyzing, not focusing on how to regionalize certain key functions, but whether to do it at all. So the timeline for the study is no longer mid-2022, it's been delayed till early 2023. And another major shift in the project has been that rather than identifying a long-term governance structure for Bay Area transit, the study is only going to set up an initial framework for governance and sort of push the identification of what should our long-term governance structure to some future phase that is still as of yet undefined, sometime beyond February 2022. So we're still not necessarily, we don't know when we're going to have this completion of this analysis that recommends what is the permanent governance structure that will lead to those outcomes for the Bay Area. Lastly, the regional rail study is another study that's even lesser, there's even less information about, that's been going on at the same time, looking at important questions around our rail system, such as, what rail network decisions would be better made at a region-wide versus an agency scale, and what types of entities are best placed to enact these types of decisions.
My speaker.
So this is,
can you help with the
apologies. This is also going on, and one of the first updates on this study is coming on Monday to something called the MTC Policy Advisory Subcommittee. But speaking to, I think, Frank's point around, by the time some of these studies come to a commission, a lot of times the decisions have already been made. I'd say this is an example of a study that's very, very important, but has been done largely so far without much public awareness of even that it's going on, or its potential interrelationship with some of these other studies that we're doing. So we really need to improve accountability and transparency, even as an interim step towards delivering on the Transformation Action Plan. This was one of the key recommendations that came out of a report that Seamless authored, a one-year report card that we published alongside other groups in the Bay Area, reflecting on how we're doing 1 year since the Transformation Action Plan was adopted. And we really feel like having a unified, balanced, and more transparent policy-making body to oversee the full set of Transformation Action Plan initiatives is an important step that we can take to assure that the network management work, that the rail study, fare integration, all of these different interrelated pieces that advance the project of an integrated system, that they're all coming to the same place and seen as a collective group of things rather than having individual sort of ad hoc, very obscure advisory committees for each of these things that are very, very difficult for riders to follow and be involved in. So that's something that we would like to see, and there's going to be the opportunity to call for in the coming coming months. So I'm going to end here with the opportunities to speak up both next week and over the next couple of months, where riders can really express the importance of governance reform. And this is always really important because it's not the most obvious thing to often call for, but it's incredibly important to our future ability to have more representative systems. So this Monday is that Transformation Action Plan Subcommittee meeting that I was mentioning at 9 a.m. Where for the first time the regional rail study and the network management study are going to be presented in one meeting. So it's a really great opportunity for riders to speak up and call for accountability, the importance of seeing through these reforms, the urgency of change, and the importance of not just stopping at these interim steps, but to make sure that beyond February 2023, we then transition to the project of identifying the permanent structures that can lead to change. And then on Wednesday at the MTC Executive Committee, there's an update on the full set of Transformation Action Plan initiatives. Again, stressing the urgency of change to our elected leaders on the MTC, that this is a top priority for riders, and the need for transparency and having a common place where all these initiatives are being reported upon. We really think those are important points to make at that meeting. So we encourage you there's a form here that I hope someone can drop into the chat. I will do it shortly, where you can sign up to be notified of when those speaking opportunities are coming up. So we'd really encourage riders to speak up. And then moving forward this fall, just to put on your radar, there's going to be further important meetings at the network management business case. Those two final meetings in November and December are going to be really important opportunities. And then lastly, Adina mentioned this at the beginning, right now, until we have a new governance structure for network management, which we hope we will have in the next couple of years, we do have to work with existing transit agency boards. And the importance of voting and electing leaders, whether they be directly elected boards such as the BART board, or those city council members and county supervisors that make up the majority of board members on all those other boards. We've created some resources for you to learn about those candidates' positions. There's a candidate questionnaire that was sent to over 150 local office candidates available on our website, as well as similar resources regarding the elected boards. So we encourage you to go to our website. These are the particular links where you can get those resources and ensure that you know the positions of candidates that are going to make up the transit agency boards in the near future. So I'll stop there, and I'll put those links in the chat in a moment.
Okay, so thank you so much. That was really very informative in terms of a variety of different perspectives about transit governance, accountability, representation, and some of the structural issues that we face in the Bay Area with a fragmented system. If you do have questions, please do put them in the chat, and we'll take as many as we can in the next few minutes. And want to ask Director Lee, and at the risk of putting you on the spot, the BART board has really taken a leadership role in wanting to address the issue of fragmentation. Do you have any thoughts that you would want to share about the accountability of a system that right now has decisions really sprinkled out amongst many different boards?
Yeah, I think there's a few different reasons for this. I think it's a little bit simple just to say, hey, it's because we're a directly voter elected board and therefore we're accountable to voters, and it's scary to not get reelected. But I don't actually think that that's like the overriding reason. I think one of the reasons I really wanted to run in 2018 was because I knew I was going to be joining a board of people who we're going to work together. And there was like really great expertise. Rebecca Salzman, Latifah Simon, and Bevan Dufty are particularly folks I look up to. But, you know, we've got a great cohort of folks. And I feel like there really has been a fairly significant culture change. I know there's some BART staff on this call, some folks who've been around longer than I am. Ian, of course, you were a former staff at BART. But I think like Grace Prunikin did so much for BART, came in at a brutally difficult time, you know, saw, you know, her early days was a 2013 strike, and, you know, a lot of things happened at that time. And she worked tirelessly to get Measure RR, the 2016 GEO bond for BART, on there. And I think after that passed, um, I think I don't know why she decided to retire or semi-retire, but I think since then we've been really, really good about rebuilding our leadership and bringing on good folks and bringing a culture of let's do things and try things in a way that like I don't think that concept of getting to yes was there before. And we've seen that sea change not only at the top with General Manager Bob Powers and his assistant general managers, but also on the board of us like working together. And I think when the pandemic hit, oddly enough, it was just like, all right, like we're in the trenches together, let's dig deep and work together. And that happened not only with like I think the majority of the board and our BART general manager and his team, but also with our labor partners. And I think this sort of in it together attitude, like I will bottle this up and hold on to as much as we can, has allowed us to do many things all at once, to not just say, oh my gosh, there's a fiscal cliff, we can't do Not One More Girl campaign, oh we can't do ambassadors, oh we can't try the, you know. And we've said, no, we're actually going to like reopen bathrooms and do all of this while addressing the fiscal cliff. And we're going to work together while doing it, and hold this together as long as possible. So there's accountability amongst one another. And I think a desire to say, like, we now have to step up as BART, acknowledging that we are the sort of backbone, the spine of the entire region. And if BART doesn't run, your other transit operators, they they won't run well at all. You know, if Muti starts like, I don't know, having issues or VTA starts having issues, I don't know how much that's going to impact Smart. But even Smart, you know, up in the North Bay, like it's so dependent on BART working really well and being high quality and being reliable and convenient. And we're not fully there yet. But I think we at BART are starting to realize like the need for us to be regional leaders.
Okay, thank you very much. And there's, I have two questions. One from the attendee, and one from some experience that I had about the project to unify wayfinding, which is the signs and other indicators about how you navigate the transit system. And there were some challenges. So there is an effort to make that more regionally unified, but there were some challenges with the accessibility and how those decisions were set up. Frank, is that something that you feel comfortable saying what happened and with that decision?
Yeah, I think couple of things we found on that is one is that I think that was a case where, again, early on, people with disabilities didn't have a lot of input into it. And then when issues were raised, we were told that certain things couldn't be done because there had already been an RFP issued and they couldn't change it. And therefore, sorry, we couldn't help you, was sort of it seemed to be the attitude. And I think that exemplified how important it is for these issues, you know, that the need for people to be included in these decision makings, and then also the importance of having disability concerns addressed throughout processes and not just at certain at certain junctures late in the projects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so an RFP is a request for proposal, and the request for proposal for the project was done without considering the auditory and tactile cues that someone who's visually disabled needs to get around. And there needed to be, there were a number of people on this call who spoke up about the need to get that project modified, but the missing accountability was it could have gotten caught earlier. It is 12:59. If folks have more questions, we can stay for up to 12:05. And someone had asked about how the wayfinding project is going to roll out. Is there a timeline? So I am not remembering the timeline in my head. We can send out information about the timeline, but there are some pilots being rolled out that are in different parts of the region about the new wayfinding. The pilots are going to be getting moving forward in the next year or two, and then the information from the pilots is going to be used to create a region-wide system. Let's see. Do we have any additional questions? I've got one for Stephanie, where you talked about the obscurity of the appointment process. Do you have any examples of places that riders focused on the appointment process and had an effect on who got appointed at the end of the day?
I think New Orleans is a good example of it. They recognized that there was power just because of the singularity of the appointer in influencing their decision making. So there particularly, I mean, in New York, even though there has been confusion historically about who makes a majority of the appointments, there has been success, particularly. So the mayor of New York actually does appoint like 4 board positions, and there has been success in the advocacy community on ensuring that those are people of color, transit riders, people with disabilities, and transit advocates actually in those positions. Those are the ones that come top of mind in this moment. Yeah.
Okay.
I can.
Go ahead, Ian.
I would just
Dina,
add.
Frank.
Oh,
Sorry,
ahead,
I just I have a hard stop at 1, so I'm going to drop off now.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. I was just going to add that in our research of different structures, Minneapolis and Atlanta were 2 in the ATL, and a recently set up agency, arguably the network manager for Atlanta, seeking to be that, had appointment processes that involved a sort of arm's length body of people vetting applications, a sort of more open application process or nominations process, and then a subset of people selecting, brought together to select qualified candidates with clear criteria. They're different from each other, but I think, and the other interesting thing about each of those is that they represented certain districts of the Minneapolis region and of the Atlanta region. So it was sort of trying to balance having geographical representation, but also appointments, but not the sort of very opaque, like one politician appoints someone and it's unclear whether they're qualified or it's because they did a favor for someone earlier in their career and then they get appointed to this. So those are 2 examples I was aware of that I think are interesting examples.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So thank you very much. Those were the questions that had come in. So I'll take, if anybody has one more question, we will take one more question. And if not, I'd like to thank our panelists and close it out. And that was really rich discussion with the different perspectives. And we are really at a unique time in the Bay Area because with the challenges of the pandemic and the challenges of the financial crisis and the awareness that change and a more rider-friendly system is needed, this is really a unique time in history to get involved and to pay attention to the decisions that are made to make the system more accessible and convenient, and the governance decisions that are being set up for how to potentially do this better in the future. So please do pay attention to the election resources and vote, and we will send follow-up information about the important meetings and decisions that you will have an opportunity to weigh in on, such that the voices of transit riders will be better heard in the decisions being made. Thanks to Janice for leadership, and TransitCenter for the national perspective, and Ian for the analysis of what we might do. So thanks. Have a good afternoon.